What's the scariest story you know that is 100% true? I work at a pizza place in Street Louis called Mouse. About 10 years ago, there was a guy who was a manager at our store named Michael Devlin. He abducted 2 children in total but quickly got caught a few days after abducting the second child. The terrifying thing is that he had held the first child, who was 11 when abducted, captive for over 4 years and pretended that he was his son. The kid even went by the last name Devlin after the whole charade was over. He abducted the second kid by following a school bus to somewhere in Buckbuck, Missouri. Somewhere where hardly anyone would be able to see him. When he pulled up in his truck, a kid in the back of the bus noticed how it was weird that there was a car in the area other than the usual ones he saw on most commutes. Next thing he knew, the kid they dropped off went missing. So he gave the police a description of it. A few days later, after reading the paper, my pizza shop owner, Mike, recognized the description and ended up filing a report on his own manager. Devlin is serving like 70 life sentences or some crazy it. Also, I work with some people who worked with him. Most I've heard them say about him is that he was a DIA. I just watched a documentary about Colleen Stan, who survived being kidnapped by a sexual sadist, who kept her in a coffin-sized box he built under his bed, 22 hours a day, for 7 years while he raped and tortured her. The victim survivor is the primary interviewee in the documentary and tells her story on camera. For most of the documentary, the cops made mention of her bravery and ability to withstand her torture and manipulate her kidnapper to increase her safety. Fatal familial insomnia. The whole story is batted and perhaps the most terrifying Wikipedia rabbit hole I've ever gone down. Only a few families have this genetic disorder. And once you develop it, that's it. You die an agonizing death from an inability to sleep. It starts off like regular insomnia, but progresses over a few years until you legit go insane and finally shut down. Nothing, not even the most potent drug, can induce sleep. Even when they tried to put them in comas, the brain remained completely active. Edit. Bong rips are definitely included in the whole most potent drug thing. Guys, I'm sure the doctors and researchers have considered the efficacy of fat bong hits to combat the insomnia. For me, I was walking back home at like 11 PM when I noticed this hooded guy behind me. I do what I read somewhere you should do and took 3 right turns in a row to see if he was actually following me, and he was. I managed to gather all my courage and yelled at him, "What the duck do you want?" with the most menacing tone I could muster, and he just turned around and left. The story of Mary Vincent. I love true crime and don't usually get squeamish, but this story is probably the most disturbing true crime story I have heard yet. Mary Vincent was 15 years old when she decided to run away from home on the 28th of September, 1978. She was hitchhiking along the highway in Sockwell, California, standing with 2 other hitchhikers. A man pulled up in a van and said he only had room for her, but not the others. The man driving the van was 51-year-old Larry Singleton. He offered to drive Mary to the I-5 freeway. As he drove, Mary realized that he had passed the ramp to the I-5 and demanded he turn around. Larry said it was an honest mistake and turned around. Soon after, he pulled over and told Mary he needed to go to the bathroom and couldn't wait for a rest stop. When he got out of the van, Mary realized her shoe was untied and got out to tie it. As she was tying her shoelaces, Larry came behind her and hit her over the head with a sledgehammer. He then proceeded to abuse and sodomize her. This is where it gets even worse. Larry took a ducking hatchet and cut off both of her arms, just below the elbow. Both of her arms. He then threw her down a 30-foot culvert in a canyon and drove off. The most astounding part of the whole story is that Mary survived. She used what was left of her strength and made her way 3 miles out of the embankment, with no ducking arms below the elbow, nude, and was stumbling down the road when she saw a car. The first car she saw sped away in fear. The second car she saw was driven by a couple who were on vacation. They stopped the car, helped her into their truck, and drove her to a nearby airport where they were able to get an ambulance and she was taken to a hospital. Mary is a ducking badass. She then testified twice against Larry, but he only served 8 years and 4 months for attempted murder, forcible rape, sodomy, kidnapping, mayhem, and forced oral copulation. Seriously, the most ducked up story. He got out on good behavior. Later, he murdered a sex worker and was sentenced to death, and died in 2001 on death row. Okay, I didn't really expect this to blow up this much. Some things to address. First, the judge was not a bad judge. He gave him the maximum sentence, 14 years, that was allowed by the law at the time. During the sentencing, he even said that he would have given Larry a life sentence if the law allowed him to. Second, Mary survived because she is a badass. She didn't give up, and was able to pack mud around what was left of her arms in order to stop the bleeding. This, in addition to keeping her arms raised, was how she stayed alive. Third, I first heard this story on my favorite murder podcast, but it has also been covered on other podcasts and shows like I Survived. If you like true crime, definitely check out my favorite murder. Tons of other interesting stories. Last summer in my city, a 14-year-old girl was raped near a train station. After her abuser left her, she tried to get help and flagged down a vehicle and was raped a second time in the car of the man who stopped. Two complete strangers raped her on the same day. It happened only a few miles away from my house and I still think about it from time to time. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up. Maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was, by some reports, involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with a carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. A relative of mine, distant, like 5th or 6th cousin I think, was a professional diver for an oil company. He would dive to check things below the surface at depths great enough to require mixed gas air tanks. He had a suit malfunction and had to be kept in one of those pressure chambers to slowly let the gases out of his body while he was breathing through a sealed face mask. Someone changed the tank at the end out, and a safety device meant to keep the air from being pulled back from inside the chamber to the outside, failed and literally pulled his lungs and stomach out through his mouth, killing instantly. My mother has a news article somewhere. This was in the late 80s I think, and happened off the coast of La Guiana and the Gulf of Mexico. Edit. Autocorrect ducking sucks. Hometown friend was tripping on mushrooms and saw a couple going at it in the backseat of a neighbor's car. Went in for a closer look and noticed he was actually witnessing a murder. Next day the house was flooded with cop cars but never heard anything more of it. Serial rapist Mark O'Leary was caught in 2011 and charged with several rapes. Now, none of these women's stories are particularly pretty, but there's one woman whose story takes the cake. In 2008, an 18-year-old woman went to police claiming she was raped. They didn't believe her and ended up charging her with filing a false report. She had to pay a fine, have a crime on her record, and get this, to stay in subsidized housing. They made her confess that she made the whole thing up. A photo was later found among his belongings. The story about David Parker Ray. More than Ray took her to his trailer and attached a dog collar and leash to Garrett. Garrett awoke, but blacked out several times during 2 days of torture and drugging. During this time, Ray noticed she was breathing and slashed her throat open. Thinking he had killed her, Ray dumped her on the side of the road near Caballo. She was later treated for her injuries at a local clinic. Neither her husband nor police believed her story. Her husband believed she had been cheating on him the night she was attacked. He filed for divorce, and Garrett relocated to Colorado. She was later interviewed on Cold Case Files about her ordeal. There was a serial killer known as the Weepy Voice Killer. He would kill people then call 911 from a payphone, crying and begging them to catch and stop him. You can find the recordings of his 911 calls on YouTube. The United States has lost 11 nuclear weapons. A plane carrying one fell off an aircraft carrier 80 miles off the coast of Japan. A bomber was carrying 2 over the Mediterranean Sea and was lost to a storm. A plane crashed over North Carolina and one was found in a tree and the other was 50 meters underground. It was never found and the government bought the land around the area. A plane crashed over Greenland and dropped 4. 3 were found but one buried itself in the ice. The worst is when a bomber crashed over Georgia and dropped a bomb into the Atlantic Ocean less than half a mile from the state. If that's not bad enough, Russia has also lost about 40. Edit 1. The nuke off the coast of Georgia is only 12 miles from the city of Savannah, which has a population of more than 146k. So it's best it doesn't explode. Edit 2. In typical Reddit fashion. Wow, this blew up. Hopefully those bombs don't. Guy was killed and cannibalized on a Greyhound bus by another passenger because apparently there were voices telling him to do it. The killing of mobster William Action Jackson. More than Jackson was impaled through his rectum with a meat hook, hanging a foot in the air. While being questioned by mob enforcers, Jackson kept insisting he was not an informer, but his torturers did not believe him. They stripped him naked, smashed his kneecaps with a bat. One of them shot him with a gun, broke his ribs, stuck him with sharp objects, used a cattle prod on his D and anus making him lose his bowels, burned parts of his body with a blowtorch, and told him how they were going to kill his wife and children if he did not confess. Then they left him for 3 days until he finally succumbed to his wounds. Edit. His wiki. Gangster. I lived in an apartment in Marina del Rey, California, 9 years ago, just before Halloween. A 3rd floor balcony was decorated with a prop of a dead man slumped over in a chair. For a few days, every time I'd come home I'd look up and think how cool looking it was and wondering why they didn't have lights shining on it at night. After a few days, people realized it was actually the resident of the apartment who killed himself. I was looking at a corpse thinking how cool it was. Story. Not the scariest thing that I know about, but the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I worked at a pretty well-known record store in Los Angeles in the 90s. A guy in his early 20s used to come in and ask me about records a lot. And one day in conversation he let a weird detail about my life slip that I hadn't told him. My dad is not American. I brushed it off, thinking my co-workers has mentioned it to him since he was such a regular. About a week later I was driving home and my car broke down. It was incredibly hot and I had to walk several miles to get to a payphone, which was outside an elementary school. I called a cab and hung up the phone, and after sitting a moment, it started ringing. So I picked it up. The person on the other end said, "Bad luck about your car, talk to me until your ride gets there." I hung up the phone, but it was definitely that guy. He had to have followed me from home, trailed me from the car, called the school to ask for the payphone number, and found a way to call me at that number. There weren't really cell phones at that time, but there was a gas station and a grocery store across the street, so who knows. I immediately quit my job and moved back in with my parents within 48 hours. I went in to visit old friends from work a few months later and they told me the guy was arrested for kidnapping. FML. Issei Sagawa, the Japanese cannibal who admitted he still fantasizes about killing and eating women after killing and eating a woman in Paris, walks free unmedicated and unmonitored in Japan to this day. Pretty creepy to know people like that walk around freely. Wikipedia. The guy who died in Nutty Putty Cave. He basically crawled into narrower and narrower passageways thinking it would eventually open up. He was trapped for many hours unable to get a full breath. After he died, they decided it would be too difficult to get him out, so they closed the cave and left him in there. I can't think of anything worse than dealing with that kind of claustrophobia. Edited to include detail I forgot. He was trapped upside down. If you climb Everest, you are basically guaranteed to see at least one dead, frozen carcass on your way up. The serial killer H.H. Holmes is the man that the term psychopath was created for. He would visit the fair and dazzle women with his beautiful eyes. Sometimes he'd kill them pretty immediately. Sometimes he'd take them as lovers or even marry them and live with them for a while before killing them. Of course, psychopaths can't actually feel love, so it was really just to escalate the trauma once he killed them. He killed them merely because he was curious, sometimes using surgical tools, sometimes by suffocating them in an airtight room, sometimes by letting gas into said airtight room, and he'd take notes on his observations as they died. Then he'd dig around in their insides for a bit to further sate his curiosity. He was jailed and hanged for unrelated crimes, back when capital punishment wasn't just for murderers. Only later did they find the meticulous documentation of everything he'd done. Ronald Stoker picked up an underage teen, Jean-Marie Humble, near Peoria, IL. He then drove her several miles out to the country, proceeded to abuse her with a knife in a very old and unused farm shed. She crawled her way at least 500 yards to nearest house and got help. That was my house. She ended up dying a week or so later. Parents never liked talking about it and still don't. Really. He fled to Costa Rica and eventually was caught. What a piece of garbage. Happened around 1997 or 98. Edit. Looks like this is an article for it. This is second hand from my mom, so I don't remember everything. But when I was younger, like 3 or 4, and she was home alone with me, some guy came up to the door. This was before cell phones and people were nicer, so she answered it even though it was like 8 or 9 at night. Well, the guy was asking if he could come in and use her phone, but she said no. He asked a couple more times before walking in and immediately got stopped by the family dog grabbing his hand and holding it tightly. He started to get nervous and my dad's dog led him back to the door. He had walked further in at this point. My mom was able to push him out and lock the door before running upstairs and calling the police. The cops picked him up a little while later and they found out he had been in a bar fight and stabbed a guy a bunch of times. Without my older brother, my mom and I could have been seriously hurt. He was the best dog ever and lived till the ripe age of 15. Back in the 90s, my mom was on the highway heading home from a friend's house late at night. She was driving a really nice Thunderbird. After a while, this big white van drove next to her and the driver started performing some very rude gestures and being young and dumb. My mom reciprocated the gestures. Then the dude pulled up a big Bowie knife to the window. My mom started panicking and sped up to get away and the van was following right along. Then the guy tried to run her off the road. Keep in mind they're probably going about 100 miles per hour. She gets on the exit to get home and he's still following her. When she does get back to her house, which she shared with my grandparents, she pulled into the driveway honking the horn and screaming, trying to wake someone up. The van pulls into the driveway just as my grandfather comes out in his underwear with a gun. The dude got scared and drove off. My mom wouldn't leave her house for months except for school, but never at night. A friend of a friend was traveling in the UK and had to hitchhike. He dropped her off at home. The next day police came knocking and proceeded to take her to the station and demand how she knows this man. What is their relationship etc. She finds out that the man had killed another female hitchhiker that same day and had her in the trunk at the same time he was driving her. The friend, for some unknown reason, he hadn't killed her. She couldn't sleep and cried for days and her home was placed on watch. My mom stayed in a hospital for a week at the same time that a serial killer worked there that was killing patients. The scariest part is I didn't even realize how close of a call she could have had until 20 years later when I was researching famous serial killers. Editing to add since people have been asking. It was Charles Cullen. Check the murder of Junko Furuta story. To sum it up, 44 days of hell for a girl who was kidnapped by teenage boys. She went through every possible torture imaginable and finally died after she was pushed to her limits. A mangaka called Waiter Yuzaga made an adaptation. I could not even finish reading it without feeling physically sick. According to the wiki, they raped her over 400 times, hanged her body from the ceiling and used her as a punching bag, dropped barbells onto her stomach several times, forced her to eat live cockroaches and drink her own urine, forced her to masturbate in front of them, shoved a still lit light bulb into her V, set fireworks into her anus, V, mouth and ears, burnt her V and clitoris with cigarettes and lighters, pierced her breasts with sewing needles. The horrific nature comes from the complete lack of empathy from her captors, who looked like completely innocent youngsters. And the fact she was a random girl who were at the wrong place at the wrong time. She could eventually be saved by the couples living in the building, but they feared the teenager boys. Imagine having the hope you'll eventually make it out with your soul because you wanna see your family again, until your body finally shut down of exhaustion. I've never felt more rage personally for such a disturbing story. That Netflix documentary about the pizza guy in Erie, Pennsylvania who had a bomb collar put around his neck then was forced to rob a bank. As a former delivery driver I was scared shitless the entire time, but also super intrigued by the investigation and the people involved. I'm really blanking on the name of the mini-series right now, but I'll try to find it and make an edit if no one comments before. The story of Vladimir Komarov, a cosmonaut who was burned to a crisp on re-entry into the atmosphere. This was caused by someone on the job screwing up, and he made them promise that he would have an open casket funeral so everyone could see what happens when you screw up on the team of a space crew. The picture is pretty NSFL and they say he screamed bloody murder as he was being burned to death. Pretty sure you can find that recording as well if you are so inclined. Edit. According to Reddit he knew it would happen. Also he didn't burn up until he crashed into the ground because allegedly the parachutes didn't go off. Regardless, he was screaming and cursing those who put him in what he knew was a botched shuttle from the beginning, so it's not much less scary that way anyway. I really wish I didn't click on this thread while doing my bedtime Reddit stories. Edit. Spelling. A kid in my town almost got kidnapped waiting for the school bus. Her mom came outside right as the men grabbed her. Edit. Holy duckles, my most upvoted comment is about my small town gossip. Can't see if someone mentioned it, but that guy on Japan that was exposed to so much radiation his skin fell off and they kept him alive to monitor him. Friend of a friend was offshore welding and his line was snagged by a fishing boat. It pulled him up and killed him because of his depth. My friend said the saddest part was the funeral. His 5-year-old daughter just staring in the coffin, left completely alone in the world. So many from the Cold War. For instance, we almost obliterated North Carolina by accident when a nuke being transported by a bomber was accidentally released. Also, in the Soviet Union, the alarm signaling an impending nuclear strike from the US went off and it came down to one man's judgment call whether or not to retaliate. The alarm was faulty and thankfully that gentleman had enough sense not to hit a red button launching the USSR's nukes. My first post on this account was an encounter that happened to me just a month ago. Link is here. And yes, I'm still waiting on the police report. Edit. No, I'm not in Florida, so the police can be rather stingy with information. There once was a man from Peru who dreamed he was eating his shoe. He woke with a fright in the middle of the night to find that his dream had come true. Newspaper report of a woman being stalked by a psychopathic ex-boyfriend. One day at work she went for her lunch break. When she came back to the open plan office, her tin opener from her kitchen at home was in the middle of her desk. My great aunt and her husband owned a successful horse farm and found out that their son was stealing money from them. After he found out, he went into their house while they were asleep and shot them to death. First my great uncle while he's sleeping, and my great aunt was found shot in her back laying across the front porch steps. He's currently in jail for a long time. My aunt was on a flight with the killer cannibal Luca Magnotta, who sent body pieces of his victims to members of parliament. He was apparently throwing up chunks of human during the flight. This was his escape flight out of the country. He was arrested in Europe soon after. Got told this story the other day. There was a girl in England who had been using the Tinder app and met a guy and planned to go on a date with him. He picked her up from her apartment and they went to a restaurant. However, during the entree just started to feel ill and asked him to drop her home. While at home she went straight upstairs to her room and was just chilling in bed as she felt ill. Eventually she hears something happening downstairs, and as she lives alone, she freaks out and called the police that there was an intruder in her house. Eventually the police come and arrest the dude she had been on the date with, but tell her not to come downstairs until they can clean up. The police beg her not to, but she insists as it's her house. She comes down and all the furniture in her lounge has been moved to the sides. There were white sheets covering everything and a set of machetes lined up perfectly. Her date had planned to murder her and had spiked her drink, hence her feeling ill. One day we will be so physically debilitated that some young nurse aide will be changing our diapers and feeding us every day while we just sit around waiting to die. My great aunt was buried alive when she was only in her 20s. The casket was brought up when the cemetery had to be relocated. The casket had broken, and she was upside down. Claw marks everywhere inside the casket. There is a rural cemetery outside the small town where I live and grew up where something that sounds like a scene from a horror film took place. In the late 80s early 90s there was a rash of serial rapes murders around the area. One of the victims, a young woman, escaped from the car of the rapist and found herself running away from the car and into the cemetery. She saw lights on a farmhouse in the distance and hope for survival flickered in her eyes. Unbeknownst to her, the darkness hid the fence surrounding the perimeter of the cemetery. She ran blindingly into it and was knocked down, allowing the rapist to catch up to her. He then beat her to death with the toppled headstone. Terrifying. Here is a link for the curious. Keen murder solved. The murder of Yvonne Pearson. She was targeted by Peter Sutcliffe, a serial killer known as the Yorkshire Ripper, for being a prostitute. He hit her on the back of her head with a hammer several times. He then noticed that there was a taxi nearby, so he dragged her behind an old sofa and to stop her from making noise, he shoved horsehair down her throat while pinching her nose shut. When the taxi left she was still alive, so he kicked her and even jumped on her chest with all his body weight, and eventually she died. He had 2 young children, which makes the story even worse. Not sure if posted here, but a woman was abducted and raped by 2 men and then stabbed over 30 times. Her neck muscle completely removed, her guts spilling out. She crawled to the hospital with her head almost detached and survived. She wrote a book and now is a motivational speaker with 2 kids, despite the fact that she was disemboweled. My dear distant, emphasis on distant, cousin started a church cult that prayed instead of going to doctors. Wife of one of them had a breech birth that they attempted to rectify at home by giving her an episiotomy with a pair of kitchen shears. Baby died. Wife got an infection that could have easily been cured if they had gone to the hospital and died a month later. Wife's family sued them and won $100,000 for wrongful death. They were still appealing last I knew. Edit, if you want the details. The appeal itself is public and goes into even more detail if you want to see how a cult works. My great uncle had an experience with a chainsaw that was less than pleasant. In front of my mum's cousin, his daughter, he was showing her how to use a chainsaw. Unfortunately he lost control of the chainsaw and it swung towards his neck, and well, he beheaded himself with this chainsaw in front of her. I have 2, and they're both tangentially related. The first is of the ant-walking alligator people of Hiroshima. Of all the horrifying things that happened in the wake of that nuclear strike, in my opinion, the alligator people are by far the most horrific. They were horribly marred and disfigured by the blast, should much so that they could no longer speak. Apparently, the only sound they made was a scream that sounded like cicadas buzzing. The other is Hisashi Ouchi. He was a worker on a nuclear plant when an accident occurred, and a tank of radioactive material reached critical mass. He received a fatal dose of radiation, but was kept alive for 83 days. At one point he even told the doctors to stop treating me like a guinea pig, but they still kept him alive. They should have let him die after a few weeks, but they used him for experiments.